workshop, Keith is going to share his thoughts and importance on the importance of incorporating sight reading and multi-key reading into elementary level piano lessons. He will also present repertoire and sight reading for developing musicianship and techniques specific to the needs of intermediate students. Thank you very much, and please take it away, Keith.
All right, thank you so much, Carl, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm really glad that we have an opportunity to do this. Like I said, of course, I prefer it when we're in person and we can actually chat face to face, but I still think technology is amazing that we have this way that we can do this. Okay, so I want to mention a couple of things. I believe you got, actually, I didn't ask Carl if everybody got this or just the US people, but a packet with two books. One is the multi-key reading, and the other book in there is the primer level lesson book from Piano Town. I'm actually not going to workshop this book today. But what I want to mention about it is that, and Carl will put up a link, there is a teacher's guide that's available at the CHOS website, okay? And basically it's my workshop written down, okay? Everything that I would say in a workshop and more is in the teacher's guide that you can access on the CHOS website, okay? And it literally goes literally starting with the cover and every single page of the book is discussed in the teacher's guide. Another thing I want to quickly mention, and I know this is part of the special discount packet you're getting, and I think we all have different feelings about this, but I will tell you I'm kind of old-fashioned. I like using pencil and paper, and one thing that really drove me crazy when we were having to just do Zoom piano lessons was that I couldn't write down with a pencil or pen or whatever assignments in an assignment book, because that's how I like to do it. So to celebrate a return to in-person lessons, I created this new piano assignment notebook, to write assignments in. And I'm just so excited to be using it with my students and being back to in-person, and I can actually with pencil write them down. I mean, I know a lot of people really like using the computer and or iPad or whatever and writing, Google Docs assignments, and that's great. It's a very organized way to do it, but I'm just old-fashioned that way. I like pencil and paper and writing assignments down. It also places for them to write things down too. Okay, so what I am going to start with, though, we're going to talk about first is the beginning piano multi-key reading. So this book is actually part of a 5-book series called Beginning Piano. There's Beginning Piano Repertoire, Beginning Piano Theory, Beginning Piano Technique, Beginning Piano Christmas Songs, and Beginning Piano Multi-Key Reading. This series was originally intended as an older beginner course, but I have found that the multi-key reading book is something I use with students of any age. I am most definitely what one would call a multi-key teacher, and I've always been that, even before I knew there was a term, multi-key teaching or multi-key reading. It was in my early days of teaching, it was just instinctive for me to teach this way, to have students learn all 12 five-finger positions within the first couple of years, and to start reading and transposing and playing in different positions. That always made sense to me. So that's before, like I say, I knew the term, didn't hear of bastions or Robert Pace, none of that. It was just instinctive. So it's really how I like to teach. And there are two basic ways that you can teach the different five-finger positions. One is to teach the whole steps and half step, whole, whole, half, whole, which is how I did it at first, when I was a younger teacher. But as time went along, I found that for a lot of students, it was just as easy to group the keys together by the pattern of white and black keys. In other words, the group 1 keys, C, G, and F, are all white keys in the one chord. The group 2 keys, D, A, and E, have the black key in the middle. The group 3 keys are black keys on the outside with the white key in the middle of the one chord, and then the fourth group is the unusual group, where they're each different. So it doesn't matter which way you teach them. It doesn't matter what you call them. You can call them five-finger pattern, five-finger positions, pentascales, whatever you like to call them is fine. It's the process that I think is important for a good technical foundation, for developing hand position, developing a sense of freedom over the keyboard, and developing good fingering habits. You know, the more your students are aware of what each key feels like in their hand, over time, the more automatic good fingering habits are, I think. It's a great way to build them in. And then for reading, which is what we're going to talk about now, I think it's so helpful and so essential, because if a student gets the idea that they're reading in a 5-finger position, but that it can start anywhere on the staff, and that the intervals work the same, that wherever they're starting from, a space to a line is a step, and a space to a space is a skip. You know, it's going to continually reinforce their reading, and it's going to move them around the staff to different places, so they don't just get stuck reading in C and maybe G. So they really move around the staff, and they will become better readers because of it. I really strongly believe that. I really do. And transposing, I think, is essential for developing good reading habits, because if a student is looking at a piece that's in G, the 5-finger position, but you have them transpose it to D, the only way they can get the right notes is to read by intervals, right? So if you want them to be really good at reading intervals, have them transpose a lot. That's really essential. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about how this book is put together. On the table of contents, which Carl has just put up, you can see I have divided it into the 4 key groups. Okay, so that's how it's organized. And now I want to show you within each group how it's organized. So we'll go on to page 4, and you'll see that there's a little keyboard map at the top, so they always know which keys they're going to use for a key. And then there's a warm-up, and it's just the 5-finger position and the broken triad. And this warm-up will be exactly the same in all 12 keys. That will not change the whole book. Every key they learn, they're going to play the same warm-up. Then underneath that, we have etude number 1 in C. Each part has its own etude. So that means there'll be 4 etudes altogether. An etude for the first part, for the second part, the third part, and the fourth part. Okay, so they're going to play this etude in 3 different keys. They'll play this in C, in G, and in F. And you'll also notice with this etude that I give the hands equal work. Now it's the left hand's turn. And you'll also notice that I'm accompanying just with fifths and not using 3-note chords in this book. I just find it's more adaptable to more types of students at different stages of development if I just stick to the 5th and not the 3-note chord just yet. Okay, page 5, then we have 2 pieces to read in the key of C, and we're really focusing on seconds and thirds, or skips and steps, whatever you like to call them. My mom, who was a wonderful piano teacher, and she's got me started teaching and taught me a lot about teaching, and she always said that if after the first 2 years of lessons your student can always tell the difference between a second and a third, you've done a good job. That doesn't sound like much, but I think we know that really is true. Getting them to always see the difference in those 2 intervals. Okay, and again, giving fairly equal work to both hands. Okay, we go on to page 6, and we're going to move to the key of G. So the same warm-up, the same etude now is written in the key of G. And at the bottom of the page, it says to play the left hand 1 octave lower on repeat. Because obviously you can play G position here or with the left hand low. And we're going to do it both ways. Okay, so we'll take the repeat of that etude with the left hand low. But then when we go on to page 7, with our 2 pieces to play in G, you see that the first one has the left hand low, but they're only playing 2 notes, okay? Because I think a lot of students can feel a little scared, a little lost when they're down low in the bass staff. So what I want to do is establish some landmark notes for them to really learn, to really practice singing. So I think that that bass G makes a good one. The very bottom line of the bass staff is G, and we really want to learn that, And then the other note they're playing is the D. And what I always do is I relate that back to to the C position. When they're in the C position, they play that same D. It's just then it's with the fourth finger, right? So they've read and played that note. It's just instead of with the fourth finger, now it's with the thumb. So we're just establishing these two notes. And then the second piece there, the minuet, of course, brings the left hand back up to the center. So they'll read in both places. Okay, we'll go on to page 8 where we read in F major, and it's similar here, where we again have the warm-up in F, the etude in F, and then repeating with the left hand lower, because we're going to read an F and play an F in both with the left hand in the center of the keyboard and with the left hand lower. So if we go on now to page 9, you can see that with these two pieces. So again, with that first one, just two different pitches, the low F and the low C. So I'm going to relate the low F to that bottom G line. We're just one note below the bottom G line that we just looked at in the previous pieces. And then the C, of course, they've played in red in the C position. It's just that was with their fifth finger on C, now their thumb is on C. So I want to establish those relationships as they look at those pitches in the low part of the bass staff. And then the next one, of course, moves the hand up to the center. Okay, now page 10. So now we're going to put these three keys we've learned kind of together by playing their chords. Here we're going to play 3-note chords. Okay, so we're playing chords not for accompaniment, we're playing chords for their own sake. What I want you to notice here is that when they play these chords, they play one hand at a time, instead of playing both hands together and then moving at the same time. I always think it's so much easier if one hand moves and then the other hand moves. And there are habits about that move that I want to establish with students. Because this happens all the time in their music, that when there's a rest, it's always a good opportunity to make a move to somewhere that they need to go, you know, rather than waiting to the last second. Use the rest to move to somewhere. So when the right hand plays its chord, that's when the left hand should move up. And when the left hand plays its chord, that's when the right hand moves up. So one hand is always moving while the other hand is playing. So that is the point of having those chords played one at a time. Now the arpeggio etude, I'll tell you honestly, I really just teach this by rote, okay? This is not really a reading exercise. I mean, you can if you want. You can make it a reading exercise, but when I teach this, I just teach it by rote. We've practiced those 3 chords, and I just say, find that low C, and we're playing one note at a time, crossing hand over hand. And then we do the exact same thing on the F chord, and then on the on the G chord, and then we end with the C chord, going a little higher. So it's really something to teach by rote, and you'll see as we go through the book, this etude is going to return, and we're going to practice that in other keys. Now on page 11, this chord etude, this we do use for reading, okay? But it's the same idea of using those 3 chords, both broken and blocked. And what I want to do with students when they first look at this, have them look through and take a pencil, and I want them to, above the staff, I want them to write the name of each chord that they say C. So in other words, in the first measure, they'll write a C because it's a C chord, and then in measure 3, we see it's an F chord, they're going to write an F, and so on and so forth through the whole piece. So we want to look at that first. Then the other thing we want to look at, which might be new for a student, when they get to measure 8, the right hand moves down and plays a chord that's written in the bass staff. Have you ever had a student come in who thought that the bass staff was only left hand and the treble staff was only right hand? Of course, that isn't true, right? Yes, it's mostly left hand, and the treble staff is mostly right hand, but there are plenty of instances in real music where, you know, it isn't like that, where the right hand plays in the bass and the left hand plays in the treble. So I kind of like introducing that here. And then, of course, at the end, in measures 15 and 16, the left hand, or measure 15, I should say, the left hand moves up and plays in the treble staff, okay? And again, one hand moves while the other hand is playing. go into page 12 where we start our group 2 keys. And we start with D. And the little keyboard map is up there. We see that black key in the middle. Same warm-up. Now we have our new etude. And this etude is designed to emphasize the fact that we've got that black key under our third finger. The first phrase ends there on the F sharp. The second phrase starts on the F sharp. And the left hand does exactly the same thing. And there we are on the F sharp again. Page 13, we go on and we have our 2 reading pieces in the key of D. You can see we're using different rhythms. We've got eighth notes going as well, and then different time signatures, 3/4, 2/4, and 4/4. Then we go on to page 14, A major. Again, we've got that black key in the middle, so we've got the same warm-up, the same etude, and again, you notice now it says to play the left hand an octave lower on the repeat, okay, so that we play the A position with the left hand in 2 different places. So we go on to page 15, and the same idea again with the left hand, only 2 pitches when it's low. And again, I'm going to relate those to what they've done previously. So that A, that they read low, is 1 step above the G line, right? When we looked at that low F, it was 1 step below the G line. Now the A is 1 step above the G line. So we keep relating to that bottom G line. And then the E, again, they played that in C position with their third finger. Now their thumb is on it, okay? So we've just got our 2 notes. So we're gradually making them feel more secure with how to navigate around the bass staff. Page 16, we go on to E major. Of course, we have 2 black keys now in the position, but the 1 chord will still just have that the black key in the middle and the white keys on the outside. So now we'll go on to 18, where we put the chords together for these 3 keys, D, D, A, and E. And it's the same idea that we just had before. So the whole thing has just been transposed, right? Again, emphasizing move hand, one hand while the other hand is playing. And then same thing just with broken chords and a slightly different ending. This one also makes a great transposition one. And then at the bottom of the page it says turn back to page 10 and transpose the arpeggio etude to A major. But of course I actually wouldn't turn back to page 10. Again, I would just teach it by rote. Starting on low A, crossing hand over hand, and so on. And then on page 19, the chord etude, same chord etude that we had in the first part of the book, but now this has been transposed to A. So they're really going to start connecting how the chords fit together in these different groups. Okay, part 3 starts on page 20, where we go into the flat keys, D flat, A flat, and E flat major. So now we've got the white key in the middle. And we now have our third etude. We have the new etude for this part, where they really pivot around that white key in each hand. Because it's going to feel a bit different to them if this is the first time they've played in D flat. And then on page 21, our first piece there at the top of page 21, we play to the white key, and then from the white key, and then the hands play together when the left hand plays that white key. So we're really still getting the feel into their hands. That's what so much of it is about. And I think what so much of good reading is about is having established good fingering habits, but more than that, having a sense of what different keys feel like. You know, I mean, if I say B flat major to you, I'm sure you immediately feel what it feels like, that slightly awkward feel of a B flat major 5-finger position. You know what that feels like in your hand. We want our students to have that same automatic response. And the other thing too, if you really want students to read intervals well, the secret to reading intervals well isn't just that students can identify them. Of course we do that in the theory book, name these intervals. But actually, the secret to good interval reading is that when they recognize an interval in a piece of music, they have a sense of what it feels like in their hand. What does a fourth feel like? What does a third feel like? What are the fingers that I most commonly use to play thirds? Well, 1 and 3, 2 and 4, or 3 and 5, you know? So we want a tactile response to what we're seeing on the page. So it isn't just a matter of identifying things coldly. You want to build these responses into their hands. Okay, then page 22, A flat major, same idea, right? Repeating with the left hand low. And when we go on to page 23, I've even slowed down the left hand. It still just has those two pitches, but I even made it a little bit easier here because of the confusion, because it looks like A major, right? If you take away that key signature, it could be an A, right? But we're actually in A flat. So I really want them to settle in on the fact that that's A flat and that's E flat because of what's in the key signature. Okay, page 24, then E flat major, and this is our final piece in this section on page 24. And then on page 26, just like we did in the first part and the second part, we're going to put all of these chords together. Exact same process. And then the arpeggios and the arpeggio etude hand over hand that I would teach by rote. And then on page 27, the chord etude one more time, but now in the key of A flat. Okay, so this gets them through those keys. Now the last part, page 28. So this is the unusual group. This is where we have B flat, B, and G flat. And that gets us through all the rest of the keys that we're going to learn in this book. And of course, this is the unusual group because they all feel slightly different. So this is one you might spend a little more time on. Not worry about going too fast because it'll be harder to relate. You know, you might even want to talk a little bit about whole steps and half steps and how they're put together at this point, but that's really up to you. I mention that because I had a student years ago. His name was James, and he was about 10 years old when he started with me, 9 or 10. And I taught him the 12 positions, but just by the key colors. And he came into a lesson one day and he said, I've noticed something about these. And I said, what's that, James? And he said, I've noticed that you skip one, you don't, and then you skip one. He basically saw the pattern of whole steps and half steps. I mean, that's just how his mind works. So always be open to that, because for some kids that is what they're going to see and how they're going to do it. Okay, so I want to show you how the book concludes. Page 34. What we do on page 34 with each key is play the 1, 4, and 5 chords, of course. So they're going to practice that for each of those. So once we have established these key groups and they're familiar with playing in the different keys, ultimately what I really like to have students be able to do is go around the circle of keys. So on page 35, this is how we finish the book. And we're going to play major and minor, so we're going to practice changing the middle note. But we're going to go around the circle of keys. And so what I say is, whatever your fifth finger in the right hand is playing, that's the next one, right? So D is next, 5 is on A, and so forth, going all the way around the circle of keys. And that's something I actually like to have them memorize, you know, and just have that be something they know how to do. It's just great for establishing keyboard topography sense in their hands, but it also is the foundation of music theory, right? Going around the circle of keys. Okay, so that is the multi-key reading book. And I have found it really useful, as I said, for all age students. I mean, I will start students in this book as young as 8 or 9, but then I'll use it with teenagers and with adults as well. It works equally well. When we finished writing Piano Town, I really wanted to write a level 1B that was multi-key and went through all 12 keys like that. But that idea was not, it just didn't happen. It just didn't work out. So that was how I got to do it. When I did this other series, I got that book in. So when I do have a student in Piano Town, when they get about halfway through the level 1 of Piano Town, I introduce that multi-key reading book so that we can play in different keys while they're still in that method. Okay, great. Now we're going to go on to the sight reading series. And we came out with this, I think, about 2 years ago. It is coordinated with the piano repertoire series. If you're familiar with that, that's an 11-level series, starting with the preparatory level all the way up through level 10. So it's the same with the sight reading books. They start with prep level and go all the way up to level 10. We're going to take a look at the level 3 book today. When I was in 6th grade, at the end of my 6th grade year, I decided that I really wanted to become one of the accompanists for the 7th and 8th grade choir at my junior high school. So I went to speak to the choir director and told her I wanted to do this. And she said, well, I need to hear you play something. So I did. I remember what I played. I played The Girl with the Flaxen Hair by Debussy. I think all the rhythms were wrong, but I was very expressive. And then she wanted to make sure I knew my scales because I had to be able to play the warm-ups. That was no problem. That was fine. Then she wanted to see me sight read. And that was not okay. That was not good at all. So she disappeared for a minute back into her office, and she came out with a stack of music. And she handed it to me and she said, learn to sight read over the summer. So it happened to be that summer I actually spent a lot of the summer on the East Coast in Tennessee living with my aunt. Every evening I would sit down to practice the piano, and my aunt would be in the kitchen preparing dinner, and she would call out, have you done your sight reading today? And I'd sort of grumble, and I'd pick up one of the sight reading pieces, and I would go through it. I'd plod through it. But that was the start of learning to sight read. And of course, the most important part of that was that I did it every day, and then it was something different, looked at different notes every day. Because that's how we learn to sight read, right? We look at different notes all the time. So what I've basically done with this series, sight reading series, is that big stack of music she handed me, I'm handing you a big stack of music. So you always got plenty of material, because what I found, with my students in sight reading, is how to organize it. How do I give them material to sight read? Do I run to my music shelf and just grab some random book? Wait, I need that book back. Oh, but you can use it for this week. Oh, that's too hard, or that's too easy. It's just hard to organize sight reading, and it's hard to keep it organized on a weekly lesson basis, so that you can make sure that just gets ticked off every week, that you always know that there's sight reading for them to do. So it's not a, 6 months later, oh my gosh, we haven't done any sight reading, right? It can just be part of the lesson, and it doesn't have to take a long time. I think, I can feel everyone panicking. How do I fit this also into a lesson? It's 3 minutes. That you need to do it in the lesson, maybe. And it's the same thing at home. It's just, you do a little bit every day. That's how you learn to sight read. It doesn't have to be a half an hour every day. It just has to be a little bit over a long period of time. Over the years you take piano, 3 minutes every day, maybe 5 minutes, depends on how long you practice. But that's enough, just as long as you're looking at new notes. All the time. That's really the key to it. Okay, so I'd like to go ahead and show you a little bit about these books. If Carl would maybe put up page 2, where I have some suggestions on how to approach sight reading. As I said, obviously the best way to become a good sight reader is to read new music every day, so that's right at the top. There are, I think, 2 ways that we think about sight reading. At least there's 2 ways I think about sight reading. And one is that kind of sight reading that you do, especially if you're in a group situation, whether it's chamber music or with a choir or with soloists, instrumentalists or a singer, or Christmas carols with your family, whatever it is, where you just play right up to tempo and get as many notes as you can, right? Get the rhythm right and get as many notes as you can, and just keep going. But I think there's also the part of sight reading that we do with our students in the lesson when we're starting a brand new piece, where you go a little slower, a little more carefully. You're working out fingerings and rhythms as you go. That is an important part of sight reading as well, because that's the part of reading of how to learn, how to read, and how to learn a new piece of music. And I think that is one of the most important things we help our students do, right? Um, is helping them know how to learn a piece of music, how to read it, how to interpret what's on the page. Okay, so that is the other part of sight reading that I think is so important with using materials in a consistent way like this. Okay, so before you start to sight read, look through the entire piece. Okay, absolutely important. Not only because you want to see the time signature and the key signature and all of those things, you want to look for moments that might be tricky. Does the right hand suddenly jump up 2 octaves? Are there suddenly a whole bunch of accidentals? Is there some tricky rhythm? You want to find that ahead of time. That's what you would do if you were in a sight reading situation, you know, that you were going to play a piece for the first time. You'd glance through it and see, is there anything I better know ahead of time? That I want to be prepared for. Okay, then as you're sight reading, so I'm suggesting to play at a moderate tempo as you do these with your students. Maybe even use a metronome to keep steady, okay? Because especially as pianists, when we play alone, it's so easy to not play in rhythm. It's so easy to change tempos, right? If you're a violinist or something and you're in an orchestra or in a quartet or something, you have to play in rhythm, right? You have to hold the tempo. But as solo pianists on our own, that can kind of go out the window. So with that metronome on, you've got something that has to keep you more accountable to what you're doing. I also suggest when sight reading to count out loud as you sight read. And I think this is important for a couple reasons, but probably the most important is that it develops a habit of knowing where you are in the measure. So that if you are sight reading in a group situation, if you are accompanying a choir or you're playing chamber music and you're sight reading and you get a little lost, you get a little off, right? You need to know where to jump back in, okay? So if you're used to kind of keeping that meter going in your head, beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, beat 4, if that's constantly going, if that's a habit, it's a lot easier to jump in. It's a lot easier to track on the page what's going on and jump back in. So I just think it's a really good habit when sight reading to count aloud. Okay. Now, probably the most important thing I'm going to say today, if you take nothing else away from this, keep your eyes on the music when you sight read. Okay. Avoid looking up and down from the music to your hands. From the music to your hands. I mean, that is just kills sight reading. Okay. For so many students, they think, oh, I just have to look down. You know, it's hard to convince them that no, you're going to make more mistakes if you keep looking down because you lose your place on the page, right? And then it stumbles and it just doesn't work. So not only keeping your eyes on the page, but learning to look slightly ahead of where you're actually playing. I think that the best sight readers are the ones who can look further ahead. Can you look 2 beats ahead of where you're playing? Can you look 4 beats ahead? Can you look 2 measures ahead? You know, I always like to challenge myself when I was a kid, and if I was playing something, you know, chamber music where somebody was turning pages, I loved being able to have them turn the page really early because I'd already seen what was there, and they could turn the page, you know, 2 bars early. But that's really key to good sight reading, that looking ahead and seeing what's coming up, not just getting stuck note to note, okay? And then, of course, keep going even if you make mistakes, okay? Because with each sight reading exercise, my suggestion is to do it 3 times, play it 3 times, okay? So you're going to have 2 more times to correct mistakes, all right? So that brings us to, after you sight read, evaluate your playing. So, you know, besides helping our students become musically literate, learning how to learn a piece on their own, I think that being able to self-evaluate is critical if we want our students to be able to enjoy playing the piano long after lessons have ended as they go on without us, okay? So obviously were the notes correct, were the dynamics and articulations correct? So as far as notes being correct, I will say in these books, we have not included things that are particularly dissonant or atonal or too out there because we want students to have some sense of when they've played a wrong note. I mean, there's no guarantee that when they're playing in G and they leave out the F sharp that they're going to hear it. But maybe they will. You know, I have a lot of students who leave the F sharp out of the minuet in G and don't realize it until I point it out. But hopefully, as time goes on and they get more experience, they will start to hear these things. So we've kept the music pretty tonal, even when we have some examples by Bartók and some other early 20th century composers. It's still pretty triadic or tonally centered, so mistakes can be somewhat obvious. Okay, now you sight reading the music again. First, you want to make sure, and this is part of the self-evaluation, is the student aware of what they need to correct in the next performance? Are they aware of what they missed, and are they aware of how to correct it so that they can do better the second time through? Now, I always say to set a goal of only 3 times through when you sight read, because once you get past playing through something 3 times, you're not sight reading anymore. You're practicing it, you're learning it, okay? So when choosing the right level for a student, if let's say you have a student who's in level 3 of the repertoire books and you give them the level 3 sight reading, let's say on the upside, they can play each one of the sight reading exercises perfectly the first time through. Well, then it's not the right level sight reading. They need to go up a level, right? Because it's too easy. It's not challenging their sight reading. But on the other end of things, if they get to that 3rd time through and they still can't really do it, then you need to drop down a level, okay? So that they aren't just stumbling, okay? And I will say, I always like to go a little easier when we start something like a sight reading course, because I think a lot of sight reading, you want to build confidence. If a student feels like they can't do it, then it's going to be really hard to make progress, because they're going to get completely demotivated and always have this sort of, I can't do this, this is too hard, okay? So I actually do like to start a little easier with sight reading to build confidence, and then push it ahead a little bit and keep it challenging. Within each book, they do get progressively harder, but within the book. But I would say, your ultimate goal is that by the 3rd time, they can do it pretty well, pretty close to tempo and pretty much all the right notes, and then go on to the next one. So this is why it doesn't take long. I will say just do 1 sight reading exercise a day, and do it at the beginning of your practice, because if you put it off till the end of your practice, you might not do it. So start your practice with it, play 1 exercise 3 times through, and you'll see most of them are just 8 bars long in this book, so it will not take a long time, okay? Now, let's say you give a student a book and you find that it is a little challenging for them for sight reading. They get to that 3rd time through and they can't get it right. So you've got to get an easier sight reading book. That doesn't mean that the book isn't still useful. So Carl, if we go on to page 3, you'll notice on the cover of the book, it says that it's music for sight reading and short study. Well, what do we mean by short study? So the thing about being a good sight reader, or being someone who learns music well, what I find is that the more advanced a student becomes with their pieces, often the worse their sight reading gets. Or I shouldn't say that it gets worse, is that it doesn't grow along with everything else. Because, at the beginning, in those first couple of years of lessons, they go through a lot of music all the time. In the primer level of a method book, they pretty much have new music every single week. So their ability to sight read and learn a new piece keeps pace with everything else. But we get into the intermediate levels where they're going to spend a couple months on a piece, maybe, if it's a sonatina or something, right? And then especially we get into the more advanced levels, and they're spending a long time on big works that they're polishing up. So they're not learning new music as often. They're not reading new notes as often. And I think, we all know that feeling of working on hard pieces, and then it's time to go on to the next and learn something new. And it's like, oh, starting all over, So the idea of short study is that, especially as students start advancing, they will always have music that's shorter, that they will only maybe spend 1 or 2 weeks on, okay? So while they're spending time, a couple months, on a harder piece that's at their playing level, They will have shorter works that they can be learning, so they keep up that process of reading new notes and learning new pieces that maybe will take 2 weeks to learn. Okay, so that takes me back what I was saying about the student who maybe you give them a sight reading book, it's a little too challenging, so you give them an easier sight reading book, but keep the other one because that can be used for short study. So you might assign one of those pieces for them to practice it for a week. Just a few minutes a day again, maybe 5 minutes a day, but they'll practice it every day for a week and actually get it learned. And then go on to another one, okay? So they will have always new music to learn while they're spending longer time on their more difficult works. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Then the last thing I want to say before we actually look at the music is the way I chose the music for the books. So this is a level 3 book that I'm showing you. I basically wanted to have the music easier than the repertoire that's in the level 3 books, okay? So the sight reading book at a given level will have music that's somewhat easier, maybe 1 or 2 levels easier than the music that's in the repertoire books, okay? And I wanted to also make sure that I put music in that would not be typical music that you would have seen anywhere, right? Because you don't want to open up a sight reading book and have the minuet in G or the solfeggetto, right? Okay, so I spent a lot of time looking for music that was sort of off the beaten track and a little bit different, okay? One of the advantages of living in England is that a lot of music that's commonly taught here and that you see in books a lot here, you never see in books so much in the States. So I had access to a lot of material that way. But it was a lot of fun for me. I really enjoyed putting these together because I discovered a lot of music and composers, or even familiar composers. I discovered music they'd written that I hadn't known about before. Okay, so let's look at some of the music. We're going to go to page 8, Carl. We'll go to page 8, and we've got on page 8 something by Bayer and something by Gurlitt. I want to talk about this Gurlitt piece. So we're going to look all the way through it right before we play. And we can see right away that it's really mostly about broken thirds, right? Melodic third intervals, okay? And that it's imitative in style. The left hand is going to imitate, play, an octave lower with the right hand is played. We want to look at those things. And then, of course, in measure 6, we've got a big move with the right hand. So we want to be aware of that ahead of time. So now the right hand moves while the left hand plays. And yes, I would have my students lift their hand at the ends of those slurs. I would make that kind of thing part of the sight reading. I still think sight reading should be done as musically as possible, okay? I really do. And the other thing I wanted to mention, in bar 3, where the hands play eighth notes together, this turnaround, they at least are playing 4 and 2 at the same time. So I might even have them notice that ahead of time. Let's go on to page 9. We have another Gurlitt, and then we have a Bartók. And these are both kind of interesting. With the Gurlitt one, at the top of the page, if you take a look at the right hand, it's a 2-bar pattern that repeats 4 times. Okay, so they get to just play the same pattern 4 times. But the interest is in the left hand, where it changes and becomes more complicated as it goes. So it's a really interesting development there. Okay, then the Bartók. So the notes to this aren't particularly difficult. This is really about getting some tricky rhythms, some slightly tricky rhythms. Super important to count out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3. That'll take times through to get the rhythm right, I can tell you. But it's a great one for that. Okay, let's go on to page 10. At the top of page 10, we have this piece by Saint-Luc, who I'd never heard of before, but it's a wonderful little piece. You know, at this point, they will be having more scale type passages in their music, and this is going to help them read in a more scale kind of way, but broken up into bits. And then number 14 by Reinagel, where this one's in D major. And I meant to mention that too. So I would say that this sight reading course is the slowest, most gradual multi-key reading course possible. By the time you get through level 10, you will have read and played in all major and minor keys. But of course, things like D flat major and E flat minor, they're up in level 9 and 10, you know. But we will have more and more keys introduced. So in this book, you are going to have D major and E major and A major. I'm sure we have a few flat keys as well. I can't think off the top of my head. But gradually, as we go through the whole 10 levels, they really will read in all keys. So here we are with this Reinagel one. And they're going to keep that right hand moving. On to page 11, we have one by Turk and another one by Reinagel, and again in different keys. We've got F major by Turk, and this wonderful one by Reinagel here in A major. The most important thing is to look through the left hand on the second line, but as long as they keep their third finger on that E, they're going to be fine. Such tuneful music. I just love it. Okay, I want to jump way ahead in the book to page 28. And a couple interesting pieces here. The first one by Ludwig Schubert, which is actually how you say it, Schubert. I know we all say Scheit or Schitta, which is really unfortunate. He's such a great composer, and I've got a book of his etudes, 18 etudes that are just fantastic. But I think the reason he never got more well-known was probably because of his last name. I don't know. But I love his writing. Anyway, this piece starts off like, not too hard. And then the second line, everything changes. And you really have to stay clued in. Then we have this little one by Bartolus, which again starts very diatonically in C, nothing too crazy happens, but then the second line of music really throws some curves at us. Oh, I messed that up, didn't I? I'm thinking about something else, which is never a good idea. There we go. Sorry about that. That was not good. And that wasn't sight reading. I've played that piece a million times. I just got distracted. Okay, page 29. We have another Gurlitt piece, and we have it in A major, so we get a little practice in A major in 3/8 time. And then another Reinagel piece. And I love this one because we think about the proportions of quarters, eighths, and sixteenths. So you get the idea. They get gradually harder. They're a little bit harder at this end of the book. than they were at the start of the book. They stay mostly in this book as 8-measure pieces or just 2-line pieces, so they won't take a lot of time. When I assign it, I ask my students to do 1 a day. I sort of assume my students will practice 5 or 6 days out of the week. And when they practice it, I want them to put a check mark for each time that they've played it through. At the lesson, what I will do is I might hear one of the ones that they did at home and maybe one new one. Okay, just to, you want to check on it. Maybe you won't do that every week. Maybe every other week you'll check up on the sight reading. Or one week you'll hear one that they did at home, and the next week you'll do a new one with them. You can just mix it up that way, so it doesn't take too long with the lesson. But you do want to check in with it periodically to make sure that they are actually progressing with it, and taking the time to include it. Okay, great. So that is about the sight reading books. Okay. And what I'd like to do now is go on to something completely different. Wow, I have really talked a lot today. I didn't realize what time it was. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is go on to a new book that you don't have, but this is Schubert, Opus 77, 12 Valse Nobles. Okay. This is a set of waltzes that has been dear to me since I was about 12 years old when I discovered them. And that was just that age where I was wanting to start playing octaves and chords and things that sounded a little more virtuoso-like. And so I just fell in love with this series. So, and I've loved teaching it ever since. The most familiar ones in here is the number 9. You'll probably have seen that in other books, but they're all wonderful. I mean, they're just terrific, and they are especially good for a student when they get to that point where they're ready to play some more octaves, but not like a really long, difficult octave, just something short where they can start playing some octaves. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to play through, is it 5 of them or 6 of them? 1, 2, 3. I'm going to play through 5 of them for you, okay? And I'm just going to play straight through, okay? And I think Carl's going to put the music up there as I play, so you can follow along. and fun to play and to teach. So I would really suggest giving those a try. They're awfully good. Okay, I have one last thing that I want to play for you, and that is the first movement of the Denver Sonatina. I wrote this about 10 years ago. I was commissioned by the Colorado Music Teachers to write this for their conference. And I'm just going to play the first movement for you. So that's why it's called Denver Sonatina. It was because it was written for the Colorado Music Teachers. So there's nothing Denver-ish about the music itself. But it's a nice selection for an intermediate student, maybe level 4 or 5, when you just feel like teaching a sonatina that's not Kuhlau or Clementi. If you just want to change, because it's written in a very classical style. So there is a second movement. It's a 2-movement sonatina, but I think all we have time for today is the first movement. Okay, so that's what I had to show you today. I hope you enjoyed that, and I would be delighted to have a little conversation and answer some questions at this point.
I'll just say quickly here before we jump into the Q&A, thank you very much to everybody who has attended today. I'm going to post our special promo offer, which is for our U.S. residents. We want all of our world visitors to get the assistance they need too. But please contact us directly, and we can figure out the best way to get the music that you've seen here today to you. So I'm posting our email address in here first, and bear with me for just a second while I put in the special 50% off promo code for our attendees today in the chat.
So there's some questions in the Q&A which I can answer quickly. The first one is, which book is Benediction in? Benediction is in this book called Perspectives. It's a set of 6 pieces, and Benediction is the 5th piece in that book. Okay. This next person wants to see the fields in the assignment book. Okay, so do you mean exactly on the assignment page? So what we've got on the assignment page is obviously date, okay? And reminders is just anything that maybe, they need to bring something next week, or a parent needs to write a check for something, or anything, right? Then we've got a practice record here, so they can put down how many minutes, all right? And then I assign scales every week. So, but this could be for, whatever, scales, chords, arpeggios, whatever you assign for that. And then whatever theory assignment you're making. And then I've got a lot of room here for repertoire, okay? And I wanted to put a lot of room. I always thought about, again, my mom, when she would teach, she liked to write really big in the assignment book. She always wanted lots of room to write. So I was thinking about that when I put this big section for repertoire. And then down here, we've got a sight reading, a place for sight reading assignment. And then other things to do this week. There might be some other thing that's just a little bit different that they need to do. And then also, if you have them in group, maybe they're going to play a particular piece in class, or a particular theory assignment, or whatever they're going to do in a group that you need to have them prepare ahead. So that's what that section looks like. I've also in here there is staff paper at the back, of course. And I've also got some invoices here. There's one for each month, 12 months. I know a lot of us do that electronically now or whatever, but sometimes, if I hand a student a book, it's nice to be able to just write it right in here in the invoice, what the cost for the book was, so that hopefully you can get, the parent will reimburse you. Okay. One of my favorite features of this book is that I have an entire page that I dedicated to my 10 tips for piano practice, okay? This is super, super helpful, okay? And a nice thing to have students refer to, all right? There is a place for them to write down what repertoire they've learned and performed that year, and a place for you to put, I did all this with stickers, but a place for you to put, your contact information as well, okay? So that's what's in the assignment book. Okay, do you teach them to read the key signatures, or are they just learning pentascale patterns? I do a little of both. I would say when I first introduce it, we are just looking at the patterns, and we're just learning it by the, what it feels like to play in each key. But I will have them do some theory exercises for practicing writing the order of sharps and the order of flats, how to name a sharp key or a flat key, by looking at the if it's a sharp key signature, looking at the last sharp and going up a half, up to the next note. If it's a flat key, look at the next to last flat, that sort of thing. So I do a combination of both, honestly. Let's see. I like how you teach arpeggios by rote. Do you find students tend to steer away from reading notes? No, I don't. I don't teach very much by rote. I have some things that I teach by rote, like that arpeggio etude. But of course, the whole point of that book is about reading. So that's actually just a little break from the reading. But the rest of the book is absolutely about reading. So no, I don't think they veer away from it. I mean, if you keep it as part of what you're doing, keep the reading as part of what they're doing. Okay. What are the next books after multi-key books? I don't have one that goes after it. I have the books that go along with it. And probably the best place, I suppose, is to maybe go to the CHOS website and look at the beginning books, and there's 5 of them. You can take a look at those. Or if you happen to have a music store that you can go into and browse through them there, that's always good too. But there isn't another level up of beginning books. The next thing after the beginning books is actually a new book I have called Progressive Piano Repertoire, and that's just strictly master composer repertoire in order of difficulty, and that is where you would go after the beginning piano repertoire book. Okay. How would you suggest doing sight reading while doing remote teaching? Well, I think sight reading is one of the great things you can do while doing remote teaching. So I would have them get, a sight reading book like this. And because it's not about, I think the hardest thing about the remote teaching is polishing up pieces, right? Having a lot of refined detail in there, because it's harder to hear it. It's harder to do every little detail. So I think sight reading is a great thing to do with the remote teaching, because it is less fussy in a certain way. It really is just about, getting right notes and right rhythm at least, I mean, if they play it musically, that's great too. So I would do exactly what I said. I would have them do one a day, and then I would, in the remote lesson, I would hear one of the ones that they did, and I would go through a new one with them. Um, and I would have them counting out loud, and I would have them have their metronome on. And the tricky thing with the remote thing is it's harder to stop them in the middle, right? But you don't want to do that with the sight reading anyway. You want to have them play straight through it and then talk about it and talk about what to work on for the next time through. So I think it's a great thing to do. Let's see, would playing with thumb on the black key confuse a student later? No, I don't think so, because we have to play with our thumbs on black keys. Um, so no, I don't think that's a problem at all. I mean, there's many times where we play with the thumb on black keys. In fact, I kind of encourage doing that earlier on, because one of the things I find that students do too often is they stay too far out on the edge of the keys, right? They don't know how to move forward over the keys when they play. And so the thing about playing in something like key of D flat is you've got your two shortest fingers, the thumb and the fifth fingers, up over the black keys. And that gets the hands right over the keys, which I think is an important facet of a technique. I really do. Let's see. As a rule for playing scale on the black key is to avoid using thumb. Well, in a scale, yes. Yes, of course, if we're doing that. But, if you're playing in a 5-finger position, or if you're playing chords, you're going to play thumbs on black keys all the time. I've never found that to be a problem, so I wouldn't worry about that. I've been doing this for, yikes, I won't even say how many years, but I've never had that be a confusing issue. Okay. I have some students who transferred. They struggled with sight reading. They get frustrated. Yeah, I know. It's so hard. Honestly, it is really hard when you take a transfer student who isn't used to counting out loud and has a hard time sight reading. It's really hard. It's one of the reasons I like to start kids when they're about 6, so it's just how we do things. But life isn't perfect that way. What I would do in that situation, what I do in that situation, is I try to balance the assignments so that the sight reading stuff will be easier, right? Like I said before, you want them to feel successful. They'll feel more motivated and encouraged if they can feel successful at doing it, okay? So I make sure that some things are much easier, easier than they're used to playing. So the music that's a little harder, I might not get quite so, I won't try to fix everything, right? So they're playing a piece that they really want to play that's a little bit harder. I might just focus on a few things in there, if it's a fresh transfer student, and then have something easier to work on, where I can be pickier with their reading and pickier with their counting, so that they can be successful more quickly. I'll tell you a book that I have been using a lot because I got a bunch of transfer students over the last couple of years. There was one teacher who moved away, and there was another teacher who got a position at a university and gave up all his private students, which I could never imagine doing that. I like my private students too much. But anyway, this book called Favorite Piano Repertoire, there's 2 books of these, and this is book 1. And what's different about this is it spans levels 2 through 5, but it doesn't say what level anything is, So when I get a transfer student and I can put them in this book, then I can be working at different levels all at the same time. I can be giving them a level 5 piece and a level 2 piece. And they don't know that. They don't know what each level piece is. So we can have a mixture. And I think teaching at multi-level is usually the best thing to do with a transfer student who has, or any student who's got gaps in what they can do. Okay. All right. We're doing this sight reading. Are the students sight reading hands? No. When we sight read, so this is kind of what I was saying, how we have in our minds, we really have 2 different ideas about sight reading. One is like that pure sight reading where you just go for it, right? And the other is when we're working with a student on a brand new piece. So yes, then we do hand separate sight reading. But if it's the sight reading books and we're working on that pure sense of sight reading where we just want to get good at playing something the first time through, it should be hands together. So in the sight reading books, I would absolutely always do hands together there. If it's too hard for them to do hands together, drop to an easier level sight reading book, okay? Because that's part of the important skill is that they sight read hands together, okay? Let's see, on page 9 of sight reading, number 11, how do you explain that you don't need to lift at the end of the slur groupings? Let me take a look, page 9. Oh, that is tricky. Okay, so I think what's really important, because we do talk a lot about lifting at the end of a slur, with our early students, but slurs are not only used for when there should be a break in the sound. Slurs are used to indicate legato. They are also used to group patterns together. So they don't necessarily mean a break in the sound. It's just showing the organization of patterns. And you'll see that all the time. You'll see accompaniment patterns where there's a separate slur over each pattern. That doesn't mean that there should be a lift in the accompaniment pattern. It's showing the organization. It's showing the grouping of things, okay? That's what slurs do. Now there's one more. It doesn't apply to this. What I just said applies to this. That's just showing the organization of the music. That's how I explain that, okay? There's one other thing to think about with slurs, especially if you're playing classical era music like Mozart, where there's a lot of fussy little slurs, and you're like, am I really supposed to lift after all of those? I can't remember where the treatise was that I read this from the 18th century, but slurs were also not necessarily an indication of where to lift at the end of the slur. The start of a new slur was showing where to show emphasis. So you can also flip it around, not get so worried about the end of the slur, but realize that the start of a slur means to show this is where the phrase starts, a little emphasis, a little articulation at the beginning of the slur. So those are different ways to think about slurs. That last one is a bit more subtle and a bit more sophisticated and doesn't necessarily apply to this level music. But I think if we realize that slurs are there not only to show breaks in sound, but also just to say legato and also to show musical organization and groupings of notes. Okay? All right. Will there be a composite list of all the repertoire from today? Chos is going to answer that one. I mean, Carl's going to answer that one.
I can put a list in the chat, Keith, and I'll do that in just a moment. I failed to mention this, but we can also take live questions if you'd like to ask one to us directly. Yeah. So if you would like to do that, or if Debbie, if you'd like to say a few words, we'd love to hear from you too. So please raise your hand and we'll get to those as well.
Great. Okay, I don't think some attendees know how to access this area. Beautiful pieces, thank you. Maybe, okay. When you have them play each sight reading piece 3 times, what would be, wait, these keep moving around. Would that be every practice session or over different practice session? Each practice session, they're going to do one piece 3 times. The next practice session, they do a different one 3 times, right? So in the course of a week, I will want them to have played, maybe 5 or 6 different ones, right? So they're not going to play the same one again the next day, right? Because then they're learning it. If it's really sight reading that you're working on, 3 times and on to the next, and that's it, okay? All right, so 3 times in the same practice session, and then they're done with it. Okay, would you consider writing a young beginner version of Piano Town? Piano Town is my favorite method for an average age beginners. Yes, yeah, it's true. It is not for the young beginner, and I have thought about that a lot. Yes, that is rolling around in my head. Absolutely, I would like to do a young beginner one. A version for older beginners would be great too. Yeah, that's rolling around up there too. That might happen sooner than the young one, but we'll see. Now, the beginning books I mentioned, those 5 beginning books are intended for an older beginner. It's not a method like Piano Town. It's quite different, but you might want to take a look at those because that's what I use for an older beginner. But yeah, both those things are going on up here. Okay, what book should I start with as an adult beginning piano student? I would start with a book called Beginning Piano Repertoire. Okay, and you can find that on the CHO site. Okay. Would you agree that most group piano textbooks tend towards the multi-key approach? I think so. Yeah, I think they're just paced differently, you know. I mean, some of them, I don't know, do tend to stay in C and G for an awful long time. I like to move it ahead a little bit faster than that. But yeah, I would say that they at least approach what's called a gradual multi-key approach. Yeah, yeah. Would you say the sight reading is yes, I would. Comparable with CM levels, Esther Judson is asking. Yes, I would say. Most of you won't know what I'm talking about with CM levels. That's the examination course in California. So yeah, I would definitely say that they're in line with that. Do you go through the whole multi-key reading book before you teach scales? I do. I have students play only in 5-finger position in all keys before we do scales. Yes, absolutely. Because I think crossing that thumb under, passing the hand over the thumb is a technique that needs to come after you have a very stable hand. And if you think about scale crossings, when you play a scale, let's see where I can put my hand, maybe you see it, you are in a way playing 2 different 5-finger positions. And that's kind of what I want it to feel like, right? When you play, when it's time to cross the 3rd finger over, it isn't just the 3rd finger that's going over. It's the whole hand is falling into the next group of 5 notes, right? 3 goes over, taking the whole hand with it. And the same thing when you go up, the thumb comes under, and then the entire hand shifts up. So the fingers are again over 5 keys, right? Thumb goes under, and we shift up. So I want that sensation of 5-finger positions in the hand, even in scale playing. The hard part about scale playing is getting the thumb under, okay? Getting it under on time. I have so many students that the thumb just stays here, and then it's time to go under, and they lurch forward, right? So it's getting the thumb under, but I still want in scale playing a sense that there's 2 different 5-finger positions. So that's why I spend all the time doing all the 5-finger positions before scales. In your repertoire books, level 9 and 10, when you put in an accidental, it is only written in one hand for the measure, even though the same note is in the other hand. I assume the whole measure then uses the no. Accidentals only apply to the line and space on which they are written. This is the whole soapbox thing for me, but I just loathe courtesy accidentals. I won't say I never put them in. Sometimes I do. But to me, the bar line cancels a sharp or flat, so we don't need to have a courtesy in the next bar. And accidentals only apply to the line and space on which they are written. Okay? That's my soapbox about that. Okay. I love the excitement in your books you've brought to Sight Reading My Studio. Thank you so much. Oh, I'm glad you like the books. Thank you. What teaching ideas can you suggest for sight reading series before level 3? Well, there's prep level, there's level 1, and there's level 2. So you've got 3 books before the level 3 sight reading book. So there's lots of sight reading. And so that prep level book is like, you know, primer level sight reading to go along with the preparatory level repertoire. Okay. Let's see. I love your fingerings out of space in your editing. Good, good, good. Do you suggest using your sight reading design to teach on page order or random? Oh, I go in page order with the sight reading. You don't necessarily have to, but there is a gradual increase of difficulty as you go through the book. And especially as we get into the intermediate and upper levels, things are grouped by skill. So you might have a section that's about broken chord accompaniments. So you might have 4 or 5 in a row, so they can kind of get used to that. So I do like to go in page order with the sight reading. But there's no reason you couldn't. You could skip around. You could skip around. But I think if you go in page order, it keeps it more organized for you and the student. You know, then you don't have to spend time thinking about it. You know, you can just go, okay? So Mary wants to know about, she's had rotator cuff surgery. Do I have any tips on getting back in shape as I resume playing? Oh, that's a hard one. I don't know if I want to try to address that here. First of all, I'm not really qualified medically to do that. But I would say, and I think this actually goes for everything. Make sure whatever you're doing at the piano feels comfortable. If it doesn't feel comfortable, find a way to make it feel comfortable. Okay? Okay, how would you handle parents balking at buying many books for sight reading? I get that question in workshops a lot. Do you really have parents balking at buying books? I've never had a problem with that. I mean, books are so much cheaper than most of the things their kids are doing. I mean, it's cheaper than going to the cinema or being on a sports team at school. I mean, I've never had a problem with that. Because they're just not that expensive, really. I don't think. But maybe for some people they are. Maybe I should qualify that. But in my personal experience, I haven't had a problem with it. If you do have a problem with it, I would simply explain to the parent why you think this particular book is necessary, If it's really an issue and you need to be careful about how many books you have a student buy, then you'll need to give that some thought and really be pick and choose. I like for my students to have lots of books and lots of material of all different things. So my students do tend to have a lot of books, but I've never had that be such an issue. Another way you can handle that, rather than having them pay for each individual book, some teachers do this where they, at the beginning of the year, parents pay a book fee, a flat fee, $25 for the year for books, something like that. And then, you don't have to worry about it so much, okay? I have so many students who cannot count out loud while playing. It's pure frustration for them and can lead to tears easily. Yeah, so I would say start easy. Have them count out loud something that's a very easy piece for them to play so that they can feel more comfortable with it. And then if it's something that's a little harder, maybe don't have them do the whole thing. Maybe just pick a couple of bars. Let's do these 2 bars, counting out loud, something like that. But the frustration comes when they feel like they can't do it, So start by making it a little bit easier. I also think what I always do is I count aloud with my students. I rarely have them go solo. Okay, I think having me there, having me counting in their ear at the same time, I'm also tracking on the page with a pencil or with my finger as we're doing it. So I'm very involved in the process, and I think that helps them feel more comfortable, and it helps them hear how it should be done, right? So they don't feel like they're performing for you, something that makes them feel very exposed, right? If you get involved with it, count aloud with them, track along the page with them, okay? Somebody was mentioning about slurs. They also show bow markings for string players. Yeah, of course, that's absolutely true. For string players, slurs have a whole nother meaning. That's very, very true. Can I repeat what I just said about accidentals applying to the line and space they are on? Okay, so an accidental only applies to the line or space on which it is written, right? So if you have A sharp in the second space in the treble staff, it only applies to the A sharp. It doesn't apply to a higher one or a lower one. Only that one, okay? That's the point. And the bar line cancels it, okay? That's the basic thing. Okay, will you address when you pass an intermediate or advanced student on in your repertoire series, does the student get the tempos to the level of excellence your recordings are? Have you considered also doing recordings a little slower? So that's a very interesting question. Tempo is a tricky thing, I'll give you a couple of anecdotes to illustrate this. When Diane and I were making the first recordings and we were doing the Bach Anna Magdalena notebook, and I was giving her metronome markings for the pieces because I didn't want them to be too fast. And I said that the minuet in G needs to be at 60 to the quarter note. And she said, oh my God, that's so slow. And she's, this was one of the funniest moments. She said, well, Keith, my students just play a lot faster than yours. And I was like, that's interesting. Okay. And fortunately, the next day she had a student come in playing that piece, and she clocked them with the metronome, and she called me back. She goes, "You're right, it was 60." And we discussed it. When a young student is playing something that's, at their envelope of difficulty level, it can sound faster because they're much busier playing it. When you, as a grown-up pianist, play it at 60, it sounds deadly slow. So how this translated into the recording sessions is that if I would try to get Diane to slow down, to play something slower, she sounded just awful. It was less musical, it sounded awkward, because as we get more proficient, as our musical ear and concept of things grows, it becomes very difficult for us to play at a slow tempo. And the idea of the recordings are an idealized model of what the music should sound like. I would say with my advanced students, I mean, if they really are, advancing, yes, I don't think there's much difference in the tempos on the recordings and what they do. I think it's more an issue, can be more an issue, as students are just getting out of the elementary and into the intermediate levels. It can be trickier. And then, of course, it depends on the coordination of the student. But so to answer your question, no, I wouldn't do recordings of them slower because it's not the music, If a student needs to play it slower, that's fine. If they're playing all of their music too slow, then I think, well, maybe the music's too hard, right? Because you do want them to play the music as it's supposed to sound, okay? So that would be something to think about as well. Sometimes we give students pieces that are a little hard for them just to push them along a little bit. And maybe they won't play it completely up to tempo, and that's fine, but also maybe that won't be for performance necessarily. When a student goes to play in a recital or a festival or something, I want the piece to be well within their grasp, technically, so that they can play it, as it should be played. So again, that comes back to what I said earlier about teaching at different levels, not keeping everything all the same, but having different levels going on, okay? I hope that made sense. I hope that answered your question. Do you have any advice on students who are transferred to you and have been struggling with rhythm for years? Write in the counts. Write the counts in the music. Count aloud. Listen, I think for some students, it's a matter of getting rhythm in their ears. Play for them. Have them listen to recordings of the pieces they're playing and other things as well. One thing that I find that is difficult for students to do that I think can help is if they listen to a recording of a piece that's in their book, can they follow along? Can they follow the score while they're listening to the recording and not get lost? That comes back to what I was saying about counting out loud as your sight reading so that you can keep track of where you are, It's a great thing for rhythm. It's a great thing for reading if students can learn to track with the music as they're listening to a recording of it. Okay, I think that got all the questions in the Q&A. Are there any more in the chat that I need to get to?
There may be a few that are very far up there, but I would, if someone has a question still that you would like to have answered, please. Oh, we have a hand raised. Great. But just to finish that thought too, please type it down further in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try to address these here.
My Q&A is open right now, so it's easier for me if I see in the Q&A.
Yeah, Q&A is preferred. It's just easier to address.
Do it in the Q&A or raise your hand and we can put you live.
Excellent. All right.
Ms.
Goldade, if you would unmute and ask your question, please.
Hi, Keith. Thanks.
Hi.
That was a great workshop. As far as counting with our students, I count with them all the time. My challenge is they often depend on me to count for them. And so I've tried whisper counting or quietly counting, encouraging them to speak louder so that they can hear it. And of course, the excuse is, I can't count out loud. I'm counting in my head. I'm like, clearly you're not.
Yeah. Well, what I was when they say I can't play and count aloud, I always say actually you can't play and not count aloud. Because it's.
I will use that. But any other suggestions when they
Yeah.
start
Well,
relying
drop in
on?
and out. Drop in and out.
Okay.
Maybe not a lot at first. Maybe just when you feel like they're treading in thin ice. If you feel like you want to check and see if they're secure, just maybe a beat here, a beat there, drop out,
Mm-hmm.
or see, I think what happens is that they'll start saying their count just slightly after you say it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You start saying it slightly after they say it. You come in late, right?
Okay.
So you can try that as well. Um, do you teach in group at all? Do you have them get together at all? Because sometimes
Go ahead.
occasionally when you have them get together, do some counting aloud exercises
Okay.
so it becomes a little competitive with the other students.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.
I think we're winding down here. So,
well, I've gone way over, so I'm sure everyone's kind of like,
we had some other
had
obligations.
enough of this.
Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and post the promo code and our link to all the qualifying titles. So please take advantage of that. I'll type our contact information in here one more time. So if you have any questions afterwards or anything we can assist with, then please let us know. But we want to say thank you so much for joining us, especially those folks in Malaysia that stayed up super late. Thank you to all our dealer partners who support us, and we hope that you'll support them too.
Please support the music stores.
Absolutely.
This has been a rough year, and they've hung in there. So please support them. And
thank you, Keith. Thanks for another great presentation. I'm sure we'll see you again soon, either in person or online here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good evening. Well, my evening has started. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.